All right.
Has anyone ever experienced 5 car accidents in one day? Probably not. This is the equivalent of playing in one NFL game. Concussions have become the ultimate long-term killer in sports. Today I'm going to talk to you about what a concussion is, the results that many athletes have received from having multiple concussions, and the ways they are trying to prevent concussion from happening. So just what is a concussion? Well, according to Mayo Clinic, a concussion is a minor traumatic brain injury that may occur when the head hits an object or a moving object strikes the head. It can affect how the brain works for a while. Although concussions are caused by blows to the head, they can also occur from the upper body and head being violently shaken. So some of the signs for a concussion is a headache, loss of memory, sensitivity to light, hard time balancing, and also hard time concentrating. So the treatments for a concussion is lots of rest, as well as a light workload, and avoiding vigorous activities by not playing any sports, as well as not watching TV or texting. So now that I've told you about what a concussion is, I'm going to tell you about some of the results that many athletes have received over the years from having multiple concussions. According to Mayo Clinic, evidence is emerging that some people who have had multiple concussions over the course of their lives are at a greater risk of developing lasting and even progressive impairment that limits their ability to function. A former linebacker for the San Diego Chargers named Junior Seau committed suicide by shooting himself in the chest. And according to an article from GQ, 8 months after his death, the scientists who examined his brain announced they had found evidence of CTE, which is chronic traumatic encephalopathy, a dire neurological disease linked to concussions, which has been a factor in the deaths of many other NFL players. A former player that played with Junior said that he asked him what was the hardest hit that he could recall, and he said that it didn't happen in a game. It was actually at a practice with him and another teammate. They were talking trash back and forth, and they ended up hitting each other so hard that they knocked each other both out. This happened also in another sport by a professional wrestler named Chris Benoit. He killed his wife and his son and ended up hanging himself after. In an article by ABC News, the test conducted by Julian Bales of the Sports Legacy Institute showed that Benoit's brain was so severely damaged it resembled the brain of an 85-year-old Alzheimer's patient. Bales and his research team say that this damage was the result of a lifetime of chronic concussions and hard trauma suffered while Benoit was in the wrestling ring. These are only just a few of the many others who have ended up killing themselves due to a lot of brain damage. Another way that many athletes have had damage is they died at a very young age. Two of the athletes, Ryan Brill, he was an MLB player. He was the first to be diagnosed with CTE, and he was only 36 years old. Another was Derek Bugard. He played in the NHL, and he was only 28 years old. So now that I've told you about the ways that many athletes have been affected by these concussions over the years, I'm going to tell you about different ways that they're trying to prevent concussions from happening. So today, if you were to watch an NFL game, you would see that the football helmets disperse hits a lot better than they used to, and they've changed over the years from trying to prevent concussions from happening. Another way they are trying to prevent concussions from happening is by putting sensors in both the helmets of the NHL and both the NFL, and the sensors basically tell the trainers on the sidelines how hard they get hit and whether or not they have concussion. And if they need to be pulled from the game. In a National Geographic, it stated the goal to ensure that the sensors in the helmet and mouthpiece come up with accurate measurements. Another way they are trying to prevent concussions from happening is the NFL has a rule now where you're not allowed to hit above the shoulders, and if you hit helmet to helmet, it results in a fine of that can range from $5,000 to $100,000. As well as now that I've told you about the ways that what a concussion is, the different ways that many players have received, I mean, the different ways that many players have, what has happened to the players over the years, causes of the concussions, as well as the ways we try to prevent concussions. Hopefully, more athletes become more aware of just what a concussion is, and we start thinking with their head instead of using their head. Thank you.
So Vanessa, what did you think?
First of all, good job. I feel like you rushed a little bit through your intro. It was a good point, but I feel like it could have been slowed down a little bit. I didn't really hear an overview, but it was apparent that you were talking about concussions. The last point about what they can do to prevent concussions, I feel like you could elaborate more. Good job.
All right, well, I won't disagree with anything that you said. I think there are more things to say, but I do think that you rushed into the speech. It does sound like you are in a hurry to get through it, and you've got plenty of time. You barely used half of the time that was available to you, so you can pause and pace yourself a little bit more. I thought, for instance, at the end of the speech that the conclusion really seemed abrupt, like just as you're getting into the process of having described what the problem is, it suddenly, you talk about what the NFL is trying to do to address that, but I don't get any information about whether or not that's successful, whether there's been any change. Do these sensors work? Do the rules cut down on the number of injuries? And some of the examples that you use are not football-based that you have, and so what about those industries, wrestling, hockey, you even mentioned Major League Baseball at one point, so I'm wondering if all sports are addressing these types of issues or not, and I don't really get much discussion of those kinds of things. I think there was a little bit of a preview, but the structure of the speech is very clear. But one of the reasons it's so clear is that your transitions are a little mechanical. I can tell that you're moving through the speech, but it's done in a way that it's kind of obvious that you're checking off. Now here's the transition that I'm having to do, and it should sound a little bit more natural and flow a little bit more smoothly. I think we've talked about this a couple of times before. Did I give you guys the smog reference? Did you guys ever hear that? When you learned to drive, did any of you use the SMOG acronym as a tool? No. All right. SMOG stands for signal, mirror, over shoulder, go when safe. All right, and it's one of those little tools that people use when they're training people. Remind yourself to do something, and you go through that. The problem is if you're still doing it when you're, been driving for 20 years and you're going through your head, signal, mirror, over shoulder, go when safe. it's not natural. It should be a point where it's just automatic kind of thing that you do. You hit the signal, you check the mirror, you look over your shoulder, and you go without even having to think about it. You're thinking about it. And we want you to get out of that process. I'm glad you know what it is you're supposed to do, but you want to do it more like it's a natural process as opposed to, like I said, something to check off. Or to Zulu, or to Scotty, or to Spock. Something to check off. Sorry.